Much has been said by others about the enigmatic Melchizedek in the Bible. I thought I'd put in my 2 cents too. He's a bit of a mysterious figure, but maybe not all that mysterious. I'd say it's really only the writer of the New Testament book of Hebrews that makes Melchizedek mysterious. If taken in his original Old Testament context alone, I don't even think he'd be a mysterious character. So what do we know about him? In Genesis 14, it says Melchizedek was the king of Salem and priest of God Most High, and he brought out the bread and wine and blessed Abram, who'd later be called Abraham, and then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And well, that's about it for Melchizedek in the Old Testament, other than a brief mention in Psalm 110 that doesn't really add much more context to him. So just looking at that brief story alone, I don't really see anything that jumps out as being mysterious about Melchizedek on the surface. Some may ask how there was already a priest of God prior to God formally establishing a priesthood of Israel hundreds of years after the time of Abraham with his descendants, Aaron and the Levites. But I think to answer that, you have to look at what the story, the Old Testament as a whole, is telling in context. It begins with the creation of man, then the fall of man into sin due to the serpent's deception, then a promise from God that he would save man from the sinful nature. From there, the rest of the story is just leading up to the birth of the Savior of mankind. So the story primarily only follows the people who are important to that narrative. But obviously there are other people around, though unless those other people interact with one of the main characters of the story, most of the other people around in the world at that time wouldn't be mentioned in the story. So with that in mind, I don't think it would be unusual for there to already be a priest of God around in this time. Keep in mind, this is only something like a few hundred years after the Great Flood. The Great Flood is like a fresh start for humanity. A soft reboot, if you will. Noah and his family come off the ark and are tasked with repopulating the world. Obviously, Noah knows of God because God told him to build the ark. After the flood, Noah built an altar to make sacrifices to God. So, it's not too much of a stretch here to assume that Noah's sons learned from him how to worship God and perform ritual duties that would later be associated with the priesthood. Which leads me to one theory on who Melchizedek is, and that is he is Noah's son Shem, who was the ancestor of Abraham. Because you see, being that Shem was born before the flood, he still had that pre-flood long lifespan and lived to be like 600 years old. So he would actually still be alive during Abraham's time. And in that context, it would make sense that Melchizedek could be Shem. But I'm a little skeptical of that only because if he were Shem, I feel like the text would just say that. Shem is a main character in the story, and specifically a main character in the book of Genesis. So why wouldn't the text just say that if Melchizedek was Shem? So with that in mind, and still only looking at the story in the Old Testament context alone, I feel like it would make more sense if maybe Melchizedek was maybe a grandson or great-grandson of Shem. My main point here being, there could still be people of that early era who knew and worshipped God just like Noah and his family. Abraham becomes important to the story at this point because God selected him to be the patriarch of the family line that would give birth to the Savior of the world, which is what the whole Old Testament story is leading up to. But it doesn't necessarily mean Abraham was the only person who worshipped God at this point, or was the only person God spoke to at the time. For all we know, God may have spoken to others about other things, but none of those things were relevant to the story being told. So in the Old Testament context alone, I don't find Melchizedek to be a mysterious figure. He just sounds like someone who was following what Noah would have taught. It describes him as being a priest and a king, which is unusual in the sense that in later times, those would be separate offices not held by the same person. But I don't know if that would have necessarily been unusual in these early times before Israel. It becomes an important distinction later on, though, because when Christ is born, he becomes priest and king. So in the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews describes Melchizedek as being a precursor of sorts to Christ, because he held the title of both priest and king at the same time. But more than just a simple comparison, Hebrews is where Melchizedek has turned into a mysterious figure. Kind of like Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings. If you know what I'm talking about, that reference should make sense. If not, it really doesn't matter. I won't be going down a Tom Bombadil rabbit hole here. Anyway, here is what Hebrews says about Melchizedek. For this, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. What? Well, that just gives a whole new perspective on Melchizedek that we didn't have before. No father, no mother, no birth, no death. That rules out Shem and basically everyone else. I mean, from that description, who could this be other than the pre-incarnate Christ? The pre-incarnate Christ figure is the one who, in the Old Testament, is referred to as the angel of the Lord, with an emphasis on the word "the," as opposed to an angel of the Lord, which just refers to some random angel who serves God. In the New Testament, after the birth of Jesus, the angel of the Lord isn't mentioned anymore. This is because prior to Jesus' birth, the angel of the Lord was essentially the avatar of Yahweh who interacted with people. When Jesus was born, he fulfilled that role as the one who spoke on behalf of Yahweh. So, could it be that Melchizedek is this pre-incarnate Christ, known as the angel of the Lord? But if so, why not just call him the angel of the Lord? That's what he's called everywhere else in the Old Testament, including many times in Genesis, so why would he be called Melchizedek in just this one passage? That doesn't really make much sense to me, but I don't know how else you can interpret the passage in Hebrews that says he had no father or mother or birth or death, unless he's a manifestation of God himself. It describes an eternal, uncreated being, and that can only mean God. I mean, even immortal angels were created by God. God is their father, and even though they don't die, they still have a creation point, or birth, if you will. So I don't know how else you can interpret a guy who has no father or mother or birth or death, except as an avatar of Yahweh himself. The only other way I could see this being interpreted as someone other than God himself, manifested as an avatar, is if the writer of Hebrews didn't mean this in a literal sense. I mean, given that he's writing this down about Melchizedek thousands of years later, this would have had to have been some oral tradition that stuck around for a long time, or a direct message from God to the writer for him to even know that information about Melchizedek. The alternative is the writer of Hebrews' intention is to just point out that the original Old Testament text does not mention a mother or father for Melchizedek, nor does it mention when he was born or when he died or what family he belonged to. In the Old Testament, he just briefly pops up in the story as a priest king of God and then isn't mentioned again except in a psalm. So could it be that Hebrews isn't stating literally that Melchizedek is an uncreated immortal being, but merely pointing out that since we don't know his family history or when he died, he's like a literary precursor to Christ, who as God in the flesh is an immortal priest king? And that's just a question I'm asking out loud because I really don't know. On the surface, I feel like Hebrews is stating it pretty emphatically. I don't really get a metaphorical vibe from it, but I could be wrong. It'd probably take a professional textual critic to make a call on whether we should take the writer's words as literal or metaphorical. So what do you think? If we're meant to take Hebrews literally, I'm not sure how Melchizedek could be interpreted as anyone other than a manifestation of God himself. If not literal, then I guess he could just be someone who kept the traditions of Noah in the early years after the flood subsided. What do you think? Any other ideas? Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.